I started this food forest 5 years ago, and every year I get more food with less work. You may be wondering how I got it all started though. So today, I'm going to go through, show you how to start your own food forest. Let's go. The first step to starting your own food forest is site selection. And this is really circumstantial, so depending on where you live, you're really going to have to judge this. But for the most part, I suggest picking the spot that gets the most sun. You can always grow shade in the future, but you can't grow more sun. Unless you live in a really dry climate, then maybe you're going to want to start in an area that's shaded a little bit and then grow some of your own plants up. But then once they grow up, you're going to want to remove some of that shade, I suggest. I'm not going to talk too much more about site selection though. My main focus today is going to be on preparation of the soil and the ground and getting planting. It's fall here now, and this is actually the perfect time to start your garden. Our main focus when starting a garden should be the soil, and not just the soil itself, but the soil life. So what we're going to be focusing on is building the soil life and providing the perfect environment for them when we're getting started. The life in the soil is what's going to build our fertility and give us that beautiful soil structure. The kind of ground you're starting on is going to affect how you should begin. So I'm going to go through a few different scenarios, what I think is going to be most popular, and give you guys what I would do and some advice on what you should do if you're going to start. So first, we're going to start with the most likely scenario, which is going to be if you're replacing your lawn with something like a food forest, something that's going to provide you with delicious food. So let's get started there. And the whole idea with starting on a lawn, whether it's weeds or grass, is that you suffocate the grass. That's what we want to do. The main focus when we start is to suffocate the grass. Because if you don't put the wood chips thick enough, or you don't have your cardboard down, or you don't have your contractor's paper down, then the grass is just going to come through and you're just essentially going to be fertilizing the grass. So first and foremost, we're going to suffocate the grass. I'm going to show you how to do that. The first way to suffocate the grass, and the way that I suggest, I think Paul Gauci does as well, is using contractor's paper. What this basically is just really thin cardboard, but it comes in this roll, so it's really easy to work with. I'm going to show you guys how easy it is to just extend the edge of this food forest, essentially creating the same thing as creating a new garden or creating a new food forest. When laying the contractor paper out, it's so important that you don't leave a gap here. You're going to want to overlap it, because if you leave a gap here, you're going to have the grass and everything coming through. And if you're in a location where you have a lot of weeds or a lot of bad weeds, you might want to come through and dig up some of those invasive weeds before you even get started. Let me show you how to roll this out. See, we've got the overlap here, really good. And then I'm just going to do the same thing, making sure I have that overlap, because that little set of weeds right there will really give you trouble in the future. If you have long grass, I suggest that you cut it or mow it down before you lay down the contractor's paper. Leave those clippings in place. They'll almost immediately turn into food for the worms and soil organisms. And if you want to get started, if you want to put compost down first, that's okay, over top of the contractor's paper. I suggest about 2 to 4 inches of that. But I would only suggest homemade compost, because that stuff's the best, and that'll really add a nice bacterial content to your soil immediately. Then over top of that, you're going to want to lay the wood chips, and I'll tell you just how much. If you want to do an annual garden, I suggest 4 to 6 inches of wood chips over top of the contractor's paper. If you have the 2 to 4 inches of compost down, then you only need about 2 to 4 more inches of wood chips. You want to make sure, again, that you have enough to suffocate that grass. And the contractor's paper is going to give you a lot of help with that. If you're going to start a food forest and you started with laying this contractor paper down, I suggest 5 to 8 inches of wood chips. You don't want the wood chips too thick for the young trees. You want to be able to get some good adequate moisture down to the roots when the trees are young. And then as the trees get older, if you're in a food forest like I have back here, an older one, you can go 7, 12, even 15 inches of wood chips. Now I'm going to get some wood chips to put on top of the contractor's paper. And this is what I love about this kind of gardening. I don't need a tiller, anything that spits out pollution and smells and is hard to work with. All I've got is my main tools here, a wheelbarrow, a pitchfork, and I'm going to need a rake. So let's get some wood chips. People often ask me how I get the wood chips. There's a few different ways that I do it. One of the ways is I just call local tree companies, and they always want to give away free wood chips because they've got to pay to dump them most places, because I live in a suburban setting here. So that's the number one way. And there's also a recycling center locally to me, and everyone brings all their trees and they cut up the wood chips there, so I can get it from there as well. And these ones here, have been sitting for a while, so these are more decayed, and I like these a lot. But my favorite is actually when I get fresh cut down trees, and the reason for that is because you've got those leaves in there, the fresh leaves and the small twigs that'll break down quicker and provide food, almost like a quick release. Then you've got the bigger wood chips like here as a slow release. But you want to make sure, if you're getting the fresh cut down trees, that you put them in the fall. You don't want to put fresh cut down trees, if you don't have to, around young plants. If you're going to get started in the spring, if you didn't prepare in the fall, then the decayed stuff is good. So let me put this down about 4 to 6 inches. So that's basically it. I'm just going to come through and continue to dump more loads of wood chips, get rid of some of this garbage in here. Make sure I keep it about 4 to 6 inches because I would be planting annuals in here. If I was planting young fruit trees, I'd do about 5 to 8 inches. So something just like that. All fall, all winter, we're gonna get the moisture and the rain coming through here. It's just gonna be slowly breaking everything down. The fungus is gonna come through, break everything down as well. And then it's gonna be like compost tea every time it rains. If you don't wanna pay for the carpenter's paper, you could use cardboard also. The thing with the cardboard that I don't like is a lot of times it has tape on it or staples, and you have to pull that stuff off, so it can be tedious spending all the time getting it ready. And it also has these gaps, so grass can come through easily. You can also use newspaper too, which is a little easier to deal with, I guess, but again, tedious with all the small sections. That's why I like contractor's paper. But if you're doing a really large section and you don't want to put the money out or the work out for either of those, you can put the wood chips really thick, about 8 to 12 inches. And what that'll do is that'll make sure it'll suffocate all the grass. One of the things with that is when you go to plant in the spring, you're really gonna have to do a lot of work to dig back all those wood chips. And when you have the plants in, you don't want the wood chips around the plants more than about 5 inches or so, 5 or 6 inches for the annuals. If it's too thick, then when it gets like a light rain or some rains, they're not gonna be able to have adequate moisture to get down to the roots. You're the ones that are gonna have to go out there and water. So that's not the scenario we wanna run into. If you do choose to go without any cardboard or any contractor's paper, it's gonna be a lot of wheelbarrows if you use a wheelbarrow, but it has to be deep. Hey, Forrest. Forrest stands up for herself, but it's gonna have to be deep, about 8 inches. At least 8 inches actually, 8 to 12, because you gotta suffocate the grass. And people ask a lot, what kind of wood chips should you get? I found that all wood chips have worked out for us. And the reason for that is because I believe when the nutrition from the wood chips becomes bioavailable, it's gone down to such a simplistic and composted state that it's basically dust to dust. It's almost all the same. So that's what I truly believe. So what kind of wood chips you get doesn't really matter, but I prefer a mix of a few different trees, maybe some oaks, some cherries, a little pine in there. And I've never had an issue. Everything always breaks down. Back to perfect. If you want to use manure, I suggest you either use your own or you get it from a place that you know is safe. You don't want to be using any kind of manures from places that give their animals antibiotics or just don't use good feeds. So what I suggest is not actually laying it down on top of the grass. That's a little too hot. You don't want to burn the grass and potentially burn the plants when you plant in the spring. What you want to do is put down about 2 to 4 inches of wood chips first, and then you can lay the manure down. And then after that, if you're going to be planting in a section here where you don't have any contractor's paper or anything, then 6 more inches on top of that. It's really better if the manure has time to seep through every time it rains as like a manure tea. That'll like dissipate how hot it is, and it'll be healthier for the plants, and that'll really help actually charge the soil life. If you're in a completely different scenario and you're not going over grass and weeds, but rather have a hard clay ground or something really rocky, your main focus should really be to get this life in the soil back as quick as possible. So a homemade compost would be ideal. You can skip the contractor's paper and the cardboard, just 2 to 4 inches of compost, just right on top of the ground. And then on top of that compost, 2 to 4 inches of wood chips. This will be really important The wood chips will actually help insulate that compost, which will make a perfect environment for all the soil life, all the worms, all the soil organisms to constantly be at work. And the humic acid that'll be a breakdown from the compost and also the soil organisms are going to loosen up that clay soil over time, because there's going to be so much life going on and they're all going to be in motion constantly. That's going to be loosening the soil. They're all going to be tilling the soil, just constantly loosening it up. If you can do that, get that down in the fall, by next spring, when you dig down, it should be a lot looser. You should be able to work it a little bit. And even if you can't work it that much, you can always plant into that compost because it's not wood chips. That was actually a compost that you put down first. Now that you finished getting your wood chips down in the fall and you have your garden prepared, it's time to spend the winter doing your research. And don't make the same mistake I did. 5 years ago, I bought some trees just at the local big box store. I didn't do my research. I got trees that were highly susceptible to diseases that I have locally here. So again, don't make the same mistake as me. Spend some time doing your research. There's a few things I suggest doing. I suggest finding out locally what kind of trees grow well. For example, if you know that apples grow well locally and pears grow well locally, then go and first get a couple apple trees, a couple pear trees, because that'll provide a good foundation. But don't just go out and get any random apple tree. Find locally what kind of issues people have with apple trees. For instance, if apple scab is really bad, then go online, get an apple tree that is disease resistant to apple scab. And the best places are reputable tree companies. There's a number of them, and a few of them I use. Rain Tree is the one that I use and I've used before and I like it. Burnt Ridge is also good for a number of things. So make sure you do your research. It'll save you in the long run. It'll save you time, it'll save you money, it'll save you frustration, and it'll save you a headache. And personally, I highly suggest bare root trees as opposed to potted trees. One of the main reasons is because potted trees, I think a lot of times they come and they're root bound, and those roots get tangled up and they'll never really untangle. When you plant it in the ground, they'll just keep getting more tangled and tangled over time, possibly even strangle themselves out in the future. I don't want that. I want to avoid that. So I like bare root trees. When they usually come, they'll usually have maybe 4 or 5 larger size roots. When you plant that tree, you can put them all in opposing directions, have them grow in different ways. This way you know in the future you're going to have a good root mass and it's going to be spread out rather than just all locked together. If you lay down your wood chips in the fall, then the coming spring you should be ready to go. What you want to do is come through and pull back the wood chips, and this part is so important. The wood chips are not a growing medium, they're a mulch. So you want to do is pull them back until you get down to the dirt, and that's where you're going to be planting your seeds and planting your trees into the dirt. So now you're pulling your wood chips back till you get to the soil level. At this time, the contractor's paper should be broken down. If the cardboard isn't broken down, then you're just going to want to cut a little section of that out, and then you're just going to plant like you would anywhere else. You can, in my area here, there's a lot of worms. And the soil is so much nicer than when I started 2 years ago over here. And you just take your seeds. If you want to just put a divot in, if you're going to be direct seeding. A couple of beans and peas mixed in here just for demonstration. And you just want to drop those seeds in. Just like you would planting anywhere else. Cover it with some dirt. And you're going to want to make sure you pull back the wood chips far enough that they're not falling in and covering your seeds too much. And I like to apply just a little bit of thin mulch, but this is all by touch. If you've never done this before, I want it. And then as your seeds come up and they get tall, once they're strong and tall enough, you can come through and put the wood chips back around the base of them as they've come into the ground. But you want to be careful. You don't want to use big, heavy, pointy wood chips around young plants because you really don't want to injure those young stems. So I like to go and apply a little bit of small wood chips around the base of the plants. And then as they grow up, and once they're really tall enough, you can bring all the wood chips back around the base. For annuals, up to about 5 inches, I would suggest. If this is your first time growing with wood chips, you'll notice you don't have to water it as much as you used to. And if you're unsure whether or not you should water, just come through, dig down close to the plant, not close enough that you're going to disturb the roots, but close enough that you get to the ground level. And then just feel that soil. If it's wet, then it's probably got enough moisture in it and the roots should be fine. But if it's really dry, then you're going to need to come through and water. Every time you do water, it's going to be like compost tea. It's going to be like fertilizing the plant. So don't overwater if you don't have to, but when you do water, you're actually helping out the plant by feeding it. If you follow the steps that I laid out, then this coming year should be your easiest and possibly your most productive year ever, especially if weeds were one of your main issues in the past. The first year, you may get some weeds coming through, and those are ones that just germinate underneath the wood chips. One thing is, they're so easy to pull out, so it's not too much of an issue, but every other year, you'll get less and less weeds. Here, I've got a number of weeds coming up, and the main reasons I had these coming up is because the chickens came through here. If you guys saw one of my previous videos, and they came through here, I let them come through and scratch and dig, and they mixed the soil. This is what happens when you mix the soil with the wood chips. Once you start mixing things up, you start getting different weed seeds germinating and coming through. That's one reason why you don't ever want to mix the wood chips. And another reason is when you mix the wood chips with the dirt, that's when you could possibly get that type of nitrogen that people are afraid about that you don't get when you use it as a mulch. And I talk about it in a video, Do Wood Chips Tie Up Nitrogen, if you guys want to learn more about that. And this style of gardening, it's all about investments. Every year, you're going to get less weeds. Every year, your production is going to get higher because you're constantly building fertility. And since you have perennials in, you should be getting a higher harvest with less work. So everything's more and more with less work in the future, and that's what an investment's all about. Possibly at the end of the growing season, depending on how quick your wood chips broke down, you may have to come through and add another layer. And that's all of the winterizing process that I'm going to get into more in the future for you guys. So that was it, guys. That's how I started the garden. That's how I started the food forest. It's not hard. It doesn't have to be expensive. You don't have to run pollution machines. But right now is the time for you to get started. The time for you to get the mulch down. So come next spring, you can get planting. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed it, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. See you in the next one.